Hey everybody, welcome to this week as we continue on our walk through the Westminster Shorter Catechism. We're on question 12 this week, which is, what special act of providence did God exercise toward man in the estate wherein he was created? The answer to that is, when God had created man, he entered into a covenant of life with him upon condition of perfect obedience, forbidding him to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil upon the pain of death. Last week we learned that God controls all creatures and their actions. And in this, God chose to exercise his government over us in the beginning of human history by this covenant of life that we read about here. So what is a covenant? If I look up a definition, it's an agreement. So you think of something that's two or more people that that come to a agreement. That would be something that would be good enough for a definition for us as humans to use in amongst each other. But for God's covenant, that's not really the case. We didn't hold equal parts in this government. We weren't even consulted. God's covenant shows his absolute sovereignty. God alone determined that there should be a covenant. God alone determined the terms, and God alone imposes those terms or that covenant with himself and on us. So it's important for us to be reminded to resist the thought that we could ever earn something from God. These are gifts from God. Even a person that never sinned and did everything they should do still did not earn this covenant with God or this gift from God. Jesus even says this. In Luke 17, it says, "So you also, when you have done all that you were commanded, say, 'We are unworthy servants. We have only done what was our duty.'" So God's covenant of life, and then later his covenant of grace, are gifts to us. They're not something that we earned. To help us with this, I will use an illustration. Think of me. I have a bone that I'm going to give to my dog. And in order for him to get this, he must obey my command to sit. It was I alone decided to give him the bone, and I alone determined what conditions needed to be met in order for him to get it. So when he sat, he didn't earn it. It was his duty to obey my command. Same goes for the covenant of life. God alone decided to give Adam this covenant as a gift, and God alone determined the condition of perfect obedience in order to receive this gift. So you may be thinking that the covenant of life seems kind of harsh. It seems a little unfair to Adam, to the rest of us as human beings. But it's not. We read that Adam was created with the ability that he needed in order to do what God required. In Ecclesiastes, it said, God made man upright. Even Satan could not make Adam sin. Adam knew Satan was tempting him in something he shouldn't do. God surrounded Adam with many things to keep him from disobedience. We read in Genesis, it says, "And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, You may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat." At the end of Genesis 1, it says, God saw everything that he made, and behold, it was very good. So Adam has this whole garden, every tree in it but this one, all of it very good. Why would you be tempted with this one thing when you're surrounded by so much to keep you from it? God even told Adam what would happen if he disobeyed. In Genesis 2, it says, "You may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die." So there's nothing unfair about it. God told him He gave him everything around him to keep him from being tempted. He even told him what would happen as a result of his disobedience. So there's nothing unfair about it. If anything, it speaks to the overwhelming sinful nature that is even in us today. Even though God gives us everything, we still choose to go against him. We were born into sin. Just think of like you were born as an American. You had nothing to do with the matter. It was all your parents before you. So you may be asking yourself now, well, I remember question 11 from last week, and if God really preserves and governs all his creatures and all their actions, then this must have been part of God's perfect plan. And if it was part of his perfect plan, then why would God allow Satan to tempt our first parents, Adam and Eve? And how can we put the blame entirely on our first parents? Those are important things to ask. But I think what's more important for us here is to clearly understand that no one but God himself can really understand that mystery. We are called and should accept the statements of the Bible, just like we learned in question 2. They're the only rule to help us on how we should be performing our chief end. So the Bible does teach us two things. It teaches us that God does control all his people and their actions, and God is not the author of sin. However, we don't know just how he does that. But the Bible tells us, it says, God works all things according to the counsel of his will in Ephesians. God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. We see that in James. The Lord is righteous in all his ways and kind in all his works. And we see that in Psalms. So hopefully we've walked through this question today of what special act of providence did God exercise towards man in the estate wherein he was created. I hope we look and ask ourselves, do we really understand how truly special we are in God's sight, in the sight of God? That he would have created this covenant, that he knew that he should create this covenant with man, that man would break this covenant, and then that he would create another covenant, a covenant of grace that we'll talk about later in another question. Just how special we must be in the sight of God for him to do all this, rather than just destroying us, as he said after Adam broke, and we inherited all this. How truly special we must be to God.